Hello, in this video we're going to look at general advice on answering problem type questions. So a spiel of kind of a case that you might have to deal with, and then at the end asking you to assess or discuss the potential liability. And particularly we're going to look at the idea of how to structure these kind of questions. So first of all we're going to start with a couple of do's and don'ts. In terms of don'ts, one of the biggest problems that a lot of students have is that they see the issue with a problem question, which is quite normal. So for example, it might be there's a contentious issue in relation to criminal defences, but then they jump immediately to that issue without leading the reader to that point by looking through the offence liability first. You have to be careful whenever you're answering a problem question to make sure you take that structured approach and you look through step by step as you go. But however, equally within that, you don't want to spend an excessively long period of time discussing something that's relatively straightforward. So also, when you're looking at a problem question, make sure that you develop your plan and you take your reader through your analysis. If something is easy, is relatively straightforward, then you can do it quite quickly in a relatively straightforward way. You still need to make sure it's done, but you don't need to over-elaborate, you don't need to go into an infinite amount of detail. And you save your discussion for those points of law or those points within the facts that are particularly contentious. Now, in terms of thinking about a structure for these kind of questions, the way that we've analysed it within the book is to set out essentially a 6-point plan. And this is something introduced within the very first chapter, and it's also something that's used within every chapter of the book when we're looking at our ION assessments section. So first of all, within every problem question, of course, you need some kind of introduction. Now, within a problem question, this should be brief. This should be some kind of indication that you understand the topics within the question. So for example, this is to do with sexual offences or property offences or whatever. But then you immediately get into, how am I going to analyse this question? Am I going to look at it chronologically? Am I going to look at it defendant by victim, or whatever it might be? And then you move into your analysis. Now, the first step 1 within your analysis, is to identify the potential criminal event. So this could be something as simple as when Sally kicked John, or when Mary took the money from the bank, or whatever it might be. But it's identifying something in the facts that you think is potentially a criminal offence. Now, having identified that event, you can now apply the criminal law and start to consider potential liability. So your second step number 2, is to identify a potential offence. Now, you can be led within this choice. It might be that the question specifically says advise or assess liability for theft, for example, in which case, of course, that's the offence you look at. More likely and more often, a problem question will simply say assess liability. So therefore, it's your job to identify which is the most likely potential offence. Now, having analysed that, or having identified the potential offence you're looking at, you then move on to step number 3, which is to apply that offence in practice. Now, that involves, first of all, identifying what the law is. So basically, actus reus, what is it, what's required within the law, statutory first, common law, of course, looking at cases, or looking at cases to interpret what the statute means, and then applying that to the facts. So what is the actus reus? Did our defendant do it on the facts in that event that you've described or you've identified? Then moving on to the mens rea. Essentially, what is the mens rea? What is the mens rea required for that offence? And then applying that again to the facts. Did our defendant act with that required mens rea at that point in time? So try and, within that analysis section, within step 3, try and remember just 4 simple questions. Actus reus, what is it? Did they do it? Mens rea, what is it? Did they have that state of mind at the time of committing the actus reus? So those 4 simple questions will lead you through your analysis. And obviously within that, you can discuss the statute, you can discuss case law, and any other sources you might use. Now, having analysed both actus reus and mens rea, you're now at a point to be able to say whether our defendant has committed that principal offence or not. And so you can move on to step number 4, which is to look at potential defences. Most of the time, this is just a brief consideration mentally. But of course, if there's something that's potentially there, something that's potentially applicable, one of the defences, then you need to apply and describe that and analyse that potential defence. And then at the end of that procedure, you can now conclude categorically whether it's likely our defendant has committed the offence without a defence or not. And that's essentially concluding in relation to that particular potential criminal event. You then, in step 6, loop back up to the top and you look on within your problem question to see if there's another potential criminal event which you'd analyse in exactly the same way. Now, as I said, within each of our chapters in the ION assessment section, we use this same structure and we identify particular issues that are relevant to particular sets of offences. Equally, elsewhere within the electronic resources, we provide a list of model essay plans, essentially, or problem question essay plans, which again uses this structure and applies it to sets of problem facts, which again you can use to help you. Thanks a lot.